July 22nd, 1456. The most powerful army in the world, led by Mehmed the Conqueror, fresh from his triumph at Constantinople, surrounded the fortress of Belgrade. Inside the walls, 20,000 Hungarian peasants and a handful of professional soldiers prepared for what seemed like certain death. By sunset, they would achieve one of the most stunning military victories in history. Welcome to ancient battlefield. Today we're exploring the miraculous Siege of Belgrade, where faith, courage, and brilliant leadership combined to hand the seemingly invincible Ottoman Empire its first major defeat. Just 3 years earlier, Mehmed II had accomplished what generations of Ottoman sultans had dreamed of: the conquest of Constantinople and the final destruction of the Byzantine Empire. At 23 years old, he was already being called the Conqueror, and his ambitions reached far beyond the Bosphorus. Belgrade was the key to Mehmed's European ambitions. This massive fortress, situated at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers, was the gateway to Hungary and the road to Vienna. If Belgrade fell, nothing could stop the Ottoman advance into the heart of Christian Europe. The Ottoman army that approached Belgrade in July 1456 was massive even by the standards of the age, perhaps 150,000 men, including the elite Janissary Corps, thousands of irregular troops, and most terrifyingly, a massive artillery train featuring enormous cannons that had already proven their worth at Constantinople. Defending Belgrade was John Hunyadi, perhaps the greatest military commander of his age. Known as the White Knight of Wallachia, Hunyadi had spent decades fighting the Ottomans and was one of the few Christian generals who had consistently defeated them in battle. But even his reputation couldn't disguise the hopelessness of his situation. Hunyadi had perhaps 7,000 professional soldiers, a tiny force compared to the Ottoman horde. But he had something else, an unlikely ally in the form of John of Capistrano, a 70-year-old Franciscan friar who had been preaching crusade throughout Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire. John of Capistrano was a remarkable figure, a former lawyer who had become one of the most charismatic preachers of his age. When he called for volunteers to defend Belgrade, the response was extraordinary. Peasants, craftsmen, and townspeople flocked to his banner, bringing whatever weapons they could find. The army that marched to Belgrade's relief was unlike anything seen in medieval warfare. These weren't knights in shining armor or professional soldiers. They were common people, armed with farm tools, hunting bows, and an unshakable faith that God would deliver them from the Turkish threat. The siege began in early July with the familiar Ottoman pattern. The massive cannons began their methodical destruction of Belgrade's walls, while engineers prepared for the final assault. Mehmed was confident. This was the same approach that had worked at Constantinople, and he saw no reason why it should fail here. For weeks, the Ottoman bombardment continued relentlessly. The walls of Belgrade, thick as they were, began to crumble under the massive stone balls fired by Mehmed's great cannons. It seemed only a matter of time before the fortress would fall, but Hunyadi was far from passive. He had positioned a flotilla of ships on the Danube, and in a daring night attack, his river fleet broke through the Ottoman naval blockade and resupplied the fortress. The Ottomans, who had expected Belgrade to be starved into submission, found themselves facing a protracted siege. The crisis came on July 21st, when Mehmed ordered a general assault. The Janissaries, the elite of the Ottoman army, stormed the breached walls while diversionary attacks struck from multiple directions. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the fortress would fall. But the Hungarian defenders, inspired by both Hunyadi's military genius and John of Capistrano's religious fervor, held firm. The Janissaries, despite their fearsome reputation, found themselves facing desperate men fighting for their homes and families. The assault was repulsed, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the next attack. It was then that John of Capistrano made a decision that would change history. Against Hunyadi's explicit orders, the elderly friar led his peasant crusaders out of the fortress in a spontaneous attack on the Ottoman camp. What happened next defied all military logic. The sight of 20,000 screaming peasants charging out of supposedly doomed Belgrade had a psychological impact. that no one could have predicted. The Ottoman irregular troops, already demoralized by their failure to take the fortress quickly, began to flee. The panic spread through the vast Ottoman camp like wildfire. Hunyadi, seeing the Ottomans in confusion, led his professional soldiers in a coordinated attack that turned confusion into disaster. The disciplined Janissaries tried to maintain order, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer chaos as their own allies fled in panic around them. Sultan Mehmed himself was wounded in the fighting, struck by an arrow as he tried to rally his troops. The sight of their wounded sultan was the final blow to Ottoman morale. The greatest army in the world broke and fled, abandoning their siege equipment, treasure, and thousands of prisoners. The victory at Belgrade sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Mehmed the Conqueror, who had seemed unstoppable after Constantinople, had been humiliated by peasants and priests. Church bells rang across Christendom, and Pope Calixtus III declared July 22nd a day of celebration for all Christianity. The human cost of this miracle was significant. John of Capistrano died just months later, worn out by his exertions, while John Hunyadi succumbed to plague shortly after the battle. Both men were later canonized as saints by the Catholic Church for their role in saving Christian Europe. The Siege of Belgrade proved that the Ottoman Empire, despite its apparent invincibility, could be defeated by courage, faith, and superior leadership. It bought Hungary crucial time to prepare its defenses and showed that the Ottoman advance into Europe was not inevitable. The victory also demonstrated the power of religious motivation in medieval warfare. The peasant crusaders at Belgrade fought with a determination that professional soldiers couldn't match, driven by the belief that they were fighting for God and civilization itself. Perhaps most importantly, Belgrade showed that military technology alone couldn't guarantee victory. The Ottomans had superior numbers, better equipment, and more experienced soldiers, but they lacked the unbreakable will that comes from fighting for survival and faith. The miracle of Belgrade remains one of history's greatest examples of David defeating Goliath, proving that sometimes courage and determination can overcome overwhelming odds. It was a victory that resonated across centuries, inspiring later generations of defenders facing seemingly impossible odds. The noon bells that still ring in churches across Europe every day commemorate this victory, reminding us that sometimes ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when fighting for what they believe in.